Imagine a quiet morning in West Germany at the height of the Cold War. A high-ranking NATO general leaves his house, gets into a staff car, and begins the routine drive to a meeting at headquarters. To him, it is just another ordinary day. The same streets, the same route, the same predictable schedule. But somewhere nearby, people have been watching this exact routine for weeks. For them, this general is not just another military officer. He is a potential gateway to some of NATO's most guarded secrets. And inside the offices of Soviet intelligence, an extraordinary idea is quietly being discussed. A plan to kidnap a NATO general on the territory of West Germany. The Cold War was not only a confrontation of armies and nuclear weapons, it was also a hidden conflict fought through espionage, surveillance, and secret operations that rarely appeared in official history. Europe, divided by the Iron Curtain, became the central stage of this silent struggle. West Germany stood directly on the front line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Dozens of military bases, command centers, and Allied headquarters were located across the country. For Soviet intelligence services, this made West Germany one of the most valuable sources of information about NATO's strategy and military planning. Soviet intelligence understood that if a real war ever began, Germany would almost certainly become the main battlefield in Europe. Because of that, the KGB and the Soviet Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, paid extremely close attention to everything happening inside NATO's command structure. Networks of agents collected documents, monitored troop movements, and tried to learn as much as possible about Western military planning. But even the most effective spy network had limits. Sometimes intelligence services needed more than stolen documents. They needed to understand how their opponents actually thought. This is where high-ranking officers became extremely valuable targets. NATO generals had access to information that very few people could see. They understood the real defense plans for Europe, the strategies NATO might use in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union, and the structure of command if war broke out. Many of them were also familiar with contingency plans involving nuclear weapons. If Soviet intelligence could gain direct access to someone at that level, even for a short time, the amount of information they might obtain could be enormous. A single interrogation could reveal insights that years of traditional espionage might never uncover. Because of this, some analysts within Soviet intelligence occasionally explored extremely bold possibilities. Among the most radical ideas discussed in classified circles was the concept of capturing a NATO general directly on the territory of West Germany. The goal would not be assassination or sabotage. Instead, the idea was simple in theory, but incredibly risky in practice. Capture the target, extract information, and disappear before Western security services understood what had happened. Of course, any operation like this would require extraordinary preparation. West Germany was heavily protected by police, military patrols, and intelligence agencies. NATO officers often had security escorts, and major military installations were closely monitored. Attempting a kidnapping in such an environment would be an enormous gamble. But intelligence organizations during the Cold War often studied extreme scenarios, even if they were never intended to be carried out. In a world defined by suspicion and strategic competition, planners believed they had to consider every possibility. And every covert operation begins the same way, with observation. For the general himself, daily life might appear completely normal. But in reality, his routine could slowly become the subject of detailed surveillance. People in ordinary clothes might appear near his house, at nearby parking areas, or along the roads he used most often. They would not look suspicious. Sometimes they might seem like pedestrians, drivers, or customers in local cafes. In reality, their task would be simple: watch, record, and learn. Day by day, a detailed picture of the general's habits could begin to form. What time he left home in the morning, which roads he preferred when driving to headquarters, where traffic forced his car to slow down, where he sometimes stopped along the way. Even small details, a favorite restaurant, a routine visit to a particular office, or a predictable pause during the commute, could become important pieces of information. Over time, these small observations could create a complete map of a person's daily life. And once that map existed, intelligence planners could begin asking the most important question of all. Was there a moment when even a NATO general might become vulnerable? Once such a pattern was carefully mapped out, intelligence planners could begin evaluating something far more specific: opportunity. In intelligence work, timing is everything. Even the most protected individual can become vulnerable for a brief moment if the situation is predictable enough. Soviet analysts understood that a successful operation would depend entirely on identifying a small window where security was limited, movement was routine, and intervention could happen quickly enough to avoid immediate alarm. Most NATO generals in West Germany followed structured schedules. Their days were filled with meetings between military bases, headquarters buildings, and government facilities. Although some traveled with security escorts, many routine movements were less protected than one might expect. During the Cold War, thousands of officers moved through West Germany every day, and constant heavy security for every trip was simply impractical. This created small gaps in protection, the kind of gaps that intelligence officers were trained to notice. Surveillance teams would focus especially on transportation routes. Roads connecting military installations were often used daily, which meant routines formed naturally. Certain intersections forced vehicles to slow down. Some sections of road had limited traffic, especially early in the morning or late in the evening. In intelligence planning, these seemingly ordinary details became critical pieces of analysis. A narrow street, a traffic light, a construction zone, or even a routine delivery truck could create a moment where a moving vehicle would have to stop. According to later accounts from former intelligence officers and declassified Cold War studies, planners sometimes imagined a scenario built around speed and confusion. The operation would need to take no more than a minute or two. Any longer, and the risk of witnesses or intervention would grow dramatically. The general's car might be intercepted on a quiet stretch of road, or forced to slow down by a staged obstruction. A van or truck could suddenly block the path. Within seconds, trained operatives would surround the vehicle. The entire sequence would have to be precise. One team would neutralize the driver and any accompanying security personnel. Another would remove the target from the car and transfer him into a waiting vehicle. Everything would happen rapidly, with minimal violence and maximum control. The objective would not be to create chaos, but to execute a controlled extraction before anyone nearby fully understood what was happening. From that moment forward, the operation would enter its most dangerous phase. The disappearance of a NATO general would trigger an immediate security alert across West Germany. Military bases would close their gates. Police units would begin searching major roads. Intelligence services would rapidly coordinate efforts to locate the missing officer. Every minute would increase the pressure on the abductors to move quickly and avoid detection. For that reason, planners considered the possibility of temporary safe locations, apartments, houses, or other concealed facilities where the target could be held for a short period of time. These locations would need to be carefully chosen, preferably in areas where foreign intelligence networks already had established support structures. During the Cold War, both Western and Eastern intelligence agencies maintained hidden apartments and meeting places across Europe, often used for covert communication with agents. In theory, such locations could also serve another purpose. Inside such a safe house, specialists could attempt to question the captured officer. Time would be extremely limited. The objective would not be a prolonged interrogation, but rather rapid extraction of key information, command procedures, operational assumptions, or insights into NATO decision-making. Intelligence officers were trained to focus on the most valuable questions first, understanding that the opportunity might last only hours. But even if such a capture succeeded, another challenge would immediately arise: escape. West Germany was surrounded by closely monitored borders, and once the disappearance of a NATO general became known, surveillance would intensify dramatically. Roads, airports, and border crossings would be placed under watch. Any attempt to move a kidnapped officer across the frontier into East Germany would require extremely careful preparation. One possible approach involved deception rather than speed. Instead of rushing toward the border, an operation might rely on disguises, false documentation, or vehicles that appeared to belong to diplomatic or official services. Cold War intelligence agencies were highly skilled in creating convincing identities and cover stories. But even with these tools, the risk of exposure would remain enormous. At this stage, the success of the operation would depend not only on the agents involved, but also on the broader political environment. If Western authorities discovered clear evidence that Soviet intelligence was responsible, the consequences could extend far beyond a single kidnapping. What began as an intelligence operation could quickly transform into an international crisis between two nuclear superpowers. At that point, the operation would no longer be just a covert mission carried out by intelligence officers. It would become a political event with global consequences. During the Cold War, every action between the East and the West was viewed through the lens of strategic rivalry. If a NATO general disappeared and investigators traced the operation back to Soviet intelligence, the reaction would likely be immediate and severe. Governments would demand answers, alliances would tighten their security, and the incident could easily be interpreted not as espionage, but as an act of aggression. This was exactly the kind of scenario that made such plans deeply controversial, even inside intelligence circles. Professional intelligence officers understood the potential value of the information a captured general could provide. But they also understood that intelligence work exists within political limits. Operations that might trigger an international crisis were often studied carefully, but rarely approved. The Cold War was already a dangerous balance of power, and both sides were constantly trying to avoid actions that could accidentally escalate into open conflict. Still, the very fact that such ideas were seriously analyzed reveals a great deal about the mindset of the era. Intelligence agencies were expected to imagine every possible scenario, even those that seemed extreme. Strategic planners believed that understanding unconventional options could help them prepare for situations that had never happened before. In their view, the greatest danger was not considering a possibility that the other side might eventually attempt. At the same time, Soviet intelligence services were far from inexperienced in bold operations. Throughout the Cold War, the KGB and GRU carried out numerous covert missions across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. These operations ranged from recruiting agents inside Western governments to conducting surveillance on military installations and scientific facilities. In some cases, intelligence officers managed to place informants deep inside NATO structures, quietly passing along information for years without detection. Because of this experience, Soviet planners knew both the strengths and weaknesses of their own capabilities. They understood that even the most carefully designed operation could fail due to a single unexpected detail, a witness at the wrong place, a security patrol arriving earlier than expected, or a routine check by local police. In espionage, success often depended on factors that could never be completely controlled. Another major concern was the unpredictability of human behavior. A high-ranking military officer would not necessarily react in a calm or cooperative way during an abduction. Resistance, attempts to escape, or even simple confusion could complicate the situation in ways planners could not fully anticipate. Intelligence officers were trained to handle stressful situations, but dealing with a senior military figure in a foreign country would add another level of uncertainty. There was also the question of what would happen after the interrogation. If the operation succeeded and the general was transported into the Eastern Bloc, the political consequences would be enormous. The West would almost certainly accuse the Soviet Union directly. NATO governments would face pressure from their citizens and military leaders to respond. Even if the Soviet leadership denied involvement, the damage to international relations could be severe. For that reason, many intelligence analysts believed that the potential intelligence gain might not justify the political cost. The Cold War was filled with delicate negotiations, back-channel communications, and fragile agreements designed to prevent open conflict. A dramatic incident involving the capture of a NATO general could destroy that fragile stability overnight. In the end, ideas like this remained mostly within classified discussions and theoretical planning documents. Intelligence agencies constantly examined extreme possibilities, but most of them were never turned into real operations. The risks were simply too high. Yet these plans still tell us something important about how seriously both sides viewed the struggle for information. During the Cold War, knowledge was often considered as powerful as weapons. Understanding the opponent's intentions, strategies, and weaknesses could determine the outcome of an entire conflict before the first shot was fired. And in that relentless search for information, intelligence services sometimes explored possibilities that pushed the boundaries of what seemed imaginable. Looking back today, many of the most dramatic moments of the Cold War were not public events, but ideas and plans that remained hidden inside classified archives for decades. The confrontation between East and West was not only fought with armies, missiles, and political speeches. It was also fought in quiet offices, where intelligence officers analyzed possibilities that might never happen, but could never be ignored. The idea of abducting a NATO general in West Germany belonged to this shadowy world of contingency planning. Intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain were constantly evaluating what their opponents might attempt. In that environment, even extremely bold operations had to be considered, if only to understand how they might unfold. Analysts would study the geography, the security systems, the behavior of military personnel, and the potential political consequences. Every detail would be examined, not necessarily because the plan would be executed, but because understanding the scenario itself had strategic value. What made West Germany such a focal point for these discussions was its unique position in the Cold War landscape. It was one of the most heavily militarized regions in the world. Hundreds of thousands of NATO troops were stationed there, including large American, British, and French forces. At the same time, just across the border in East Germany, the Soviet Union maintained one of its largest military deployments outside its own territory. Both sides watched each other constantly. Surveillance aircraft flew near borders, intelligence agents tracked military movements, and communication signals were intercepted around the clock. In such an environment, every action carried potential consequences. A single miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction that neither side truly wanted. History has shown that the Cold War was filled with moments where misunderstanding or misinterpretation nearly led to serious crises. Because of that, intelligence organizations were often cautious when considering operations that could attract too much attention. Plans that involved the capture of a senior NATO officer would fall into exactly that category. Even if the operation were technically successful, the strategic damage could be far greater than the intelligence gained. Political leaders on both sides of the divide understood that maintaining a fragile balance was essential. The Cold War was dangerous precisely because both sides possessed enormous military power, including nuclear weapons. Any event that threatened to disrupt that balance had to be treated with extreme caution. Over time, as more documents from the Cold War period became public, historians began to see just how many unusual ideas had been studied by intelligence agencies. Some involved espionage technologies, others explored psychological warfare, sabotage operations, or unconventional methods of gathering information. Most of these ideas were never implemented, but they reflected the intense atmosphere of strategic competition that defined the era. In the end, the plan to kidnap a NATO general remained exactly what it began as, a theoretical possibility discussed in analytical circles. There is no evidence that such an operation was ever attempted, but the fact that intelligence officers seriously examined the idea reveals something important about the nature of the Cold War. It was a conflict where information was considered one of the most valuable weapons, and both sides were constantly searching for ways to gain an advantage without triggering open war. Today, it is easy to forget how tense those decades were. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies were constantly preparing for scenarios that might never occur, simply because the stakes were so high. And sometimes buried deep inside those preparations were plans so bold that even the people who studied them understood they might never leave the pages of a classified report.